There we go. Okay. Well, good morning, and thanks very much, everybody, for coming to this session on ensemble. When Ryan and I were talking about this workshop, um, we talked about the fact that a lot of ensemble workshops sort of get into kind of the broad theory of ensemble and of course some of the things like the four eyes, and maybe a little bit of practical advice about where to stand, around the circle if you're a judge judging ensemble and that sort of stuff. And oftentimes it sort of the workshop evolves into, well, I like this or I like that, or why can't bands do more of this or that? And what we felt was kind of missing was a couple of things that would help us to become better adjudicators in general and better listeners as well. And that is how to listen to the entire band, how to listen to more than one instrument at a time. And number two, what language do you use to convey those observations that you make, as opposed to band is not playing together, or band didn't end all at the same time, or that sort of thing. But let's expand our vocabulary a bit so that we're better at conveying those observations to the band in question. To the man that needs no introduction, I'll introduce him, and that's everybody knows Ryan Murray for his accomplishments as a piper, as a musician, and especially in this case as an orchestral conductor. I think that if any of you read any of the homework assignments, or at least glanced through them, or maybe even just downloaded them and looked at them briefly, you'll see that there's going to be a lot of discussion of things that relate to the orchestra and that also relate to pipe bands. So without further ado, Ryan, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Ken. Well, thanks for being here, everybody. Nice to see you. So as Ken mentioned, today our goal is really to have a discussion about ensemble judging and ways that we can be more effective as judges. And what worked really nicely, I thought, on Thursday is there was a lot of discussion as well. So, certainly open for discussion, not just a one-sided presentation. And before I kind of delve into things, I just want to give a little disclaimer about classical music and piping, because there are a lot of differences. And, sometimes I've been coaching a band or working with a student, and they'll say, well, actually, I'm a classical musician, and you didn't write this correctly. And I have the fun job of saying, well, I have 2 degrees in it, so I actually did write it correctly. But, sometimes that gets thrown around like, oh, piping just does everything incorrectly, or this isn't written right. And just like any kind of music, there's traditions and style that you have to master and understand. So, don't let any classical musicians push you around when it comes to piping and drumming, because it really is different. But I can say for sure that studying music seriously and conducting orchestras has done a lot to translate into my piping, and definitely improved my ear and my ability to rehearse and a sense for band ensemble. And the couple of years I spent as a pipe major of the Sacramento band, I could say that, being a pipe major and being a conductor, there's a lot of similarities and a lot of things that translate. So today our goal is to talk about how we can improve our listening skills and how we can better verbalize what we're hearing. And we're going to try to avoid, although I'm sure we'll go there a little bit, what makes an ideal performance or what makes good ensemble, rather talk about ways that we can evaluate the ensemble that we're hearing. So I think it makes sense to start with listening first, and I'm going to put a little PowerPoint on here just so that I keep track of where I am. And when it comes to listening, there's a couple different areas that we can talk about. There's the role that the ears play in actually physically hearing the music, but probably more important is the role that the brain plays in processing what we're hearing. And there's kind of 2 sides to this. There's hearing the physical sound, and then there's our inner ear, or the ability to hold sounds in our head without actually hearing sound. And maybe that's even the more important thing. And so as a conductor, listening is our main job. It's 80 to 90%. And I think with adjudication, it's about the same. We have to write a sheet and we have to place the bands, but really it's all about listening and our ability to listen and process sound and information. And as a conductor, I've been working with professional orchestras for about 15 years now. And I don't really think that all that much has changed with what I do with my hands, but I can say that so many things have changed with my ears and my ability to hear multiple things and my ability to hold the sound of the orchestra in my head and my ability to look at a piece of music and hear it without playing it, just hear it by looking at it. And so those are all skills that I think translate really well to piping and to judging. So if you had a chance to read the article by Courtney Lewis, if you hadn't had a chance, take a look at that one. It's a nice short article. He talks about this phenomenon of standing in front of a group and all of a sudden being unable to hear. And that's something that I've experienced as a conductor, and certainly my students, and probably even the first few times I played in a really good pipe band, of you're just kind of overwhelmed by the sound that's coming at you. I could always hear just fine in the hall, but there's something strange about that 2 feet of stepping up onto the podium that removes your ability to hear the sound in front of you. And it's sort of similar when you listen to a lot of bands in a row, or that awful feeling of being able to tune your drones 364 days out of the year, and then that one day you're on the silver medal platform, and you can't hear your bass drone, or you can't hear if that F is sharp or not, And so that's our brain kind of messing with our ears. But we often talk about people saying she or he has really good ears, but I think what we're talking about is their ability to organize the sound that they hear and their ability to hold the perfect scale in their minds. So we've certainly seen the great pipe majors that can go around with no tuner and maybe even not a reference chanter, and they can say, oh, that F is sharp, that E is flat, because the sound is so strongly in their minds. And if you had a chance to read the chapter by Oliver Sacks from Musicophilia, which is a fantastic book about the brain and music, he talks about developing the musical imagination, which I think is a great term for it. So there's many chapters in his book about the connection between the brain and the ear, and how patients that have lost some of their hearing, or even one that completely lost hearing in one ear, that over time the brain can compensate for that, and this particular patient could relearn how to hear in stereo. So the point of all of this is that there's so much going on in the brain, and we can actually train our ears. We can make our ears better. We can improve our ability to hear unique sounds and combinations of sounds by working on expanding this musical imagination. And so there's a couple things that I work with conducting students on, and that I've worked on myself to try to improve those ears. And the first thing is just listening to as much music as possible, which we all know already. I mean, I still often, if I'm headed to a band practice where I've got to tune up the pipe corps, I've got Phil Marshall on the stereo on the way there, just to get one more earful of the perfect F and that slightly low D, just to make sure I can set the chanters the way I want. And it's a little bit like putting gas in the car. You have to keep filling up this internal ear, this musical imagination, to keep it sharp. And then a couple other things that I like to do are to force myself to multitask. So one exercise that I used to do was to put the TV on, and then the radio on, and then also a musical performance on, and have all three things playing at the same time, and then practice pivoting my attention. So I'd see if I could focus solely on the TV and ignore the other two, and then focus solely on the radio, or maybe the radio plus the TV but ignore the musical recording, or then try another combination of two, and then all three. And being able to kind of focus the mind and pivot your attention can be really valuable when you're judging an ensemble or trying to figure out where the problem areas are. And then as that becomes more advanced, you could try to put on 3 musical performances all at the same time and, write a little summary of what you're hearing. Because if you can judge 3 bands at the same time and have something valuable to say, then judging one band is not so bad. So that kind of pushes the ears a bit. And then when it comes to the inner ear, or the musical imagination, there are some exercises here. So when you study music at the university level, you have what they call ear training classes, which are everybody's least favorite classes in school. And as you become a conductor, they become even more complicated and challenging. I had a conducting teacher that used to play one note with his pinky and say, okay, this is an A. And then he would play 9 other notes with the other 9 fingers all at the same time, and I had to write down what the notes were. So based on knowing that the first note was an A, I had to kind of hear the intervals between all the other notes. And you rarely can actually do it well, but the act of practicing kind of stretches the ear. So we can do that as pipers and drummers, and one thing that we can do is listen to pieces that we like, or listen to tunes that we like, and try to write them down. And see how few times you can listen to it and write it. You know, a suggestion would be, rather than just playing it and trying to get 1 bar and then play 8 bars and then stop the tape, and see how much you can get in a minute and a half of trying to, not hear it again, and then play it a second time. And, by the 3rd time, you should have pretty close to everything written down. And we can, as pipers, try to do that with the drumming music as well. If we could get at least the basic accents and the rhythmic structure, that would really help us to understand what's happening at the back end. Maybe we don't get the embellishments and things, but at least the rhythmic structure. And drummers could try to outline the melody that the pipers are playing, even if you don't, have the musical notation skills to write the exact pitches. You can write if things are going up or going down, get the contour and shape, because the rhythm is going to be no problem for drummers. Then you can go in the other direction and try to look at printed music and hear it. And as pipers, this is not so bad because we have such a limited scale already, right? So we kind of get used to being able to hear our notes. But when I started doing this as a conductor, I started with 1 line, and then I went to 2 lines, and then string quartets and small symphonies, and finally the big pieces, something like this Strauss tone poem here, which has, 27 individual parts. And I don't think I can quite hear all the parts in my head at the same time yet, but I'm certainly getting closer. I think in another 30 years I might be able to do it. But it's, something that we keep working on. And so we can take that example and take it over to piping music. So this is from the Tutorin textbook, number 1. I think it's the blue one. And it'd be no problem here for pipers to look at the first 2 bars and hear that in our head. We all know this tune anyway. But, we can just try to imagine the sound, try to hear the sound of a beautifully tuned bagpipe, and hear the tune in our head. Now, what might be more difficult is to look at the drum section. So if we go down to the 4th line, which I assume is the bass drum, rather than just hearing the rhythm, try to also hear in your head the sound of a good bass drum. That really resonant, full pitch. And so, bass drum rhythmically, bum, 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 really simple rhythm, right? But imagine that low A of that bass drum. And then look at the next line up as the tenor line. And let's just put the tenors, let's just pitch them an octave above for now. So we've just got an A and an A. So now if you can in your mind, hear those 2 A's playing together, hear that octave. Just a couple bars. And then maybe throw in another tenor, pitch another tenor a 5th higher at an E. So if we've got an A, and then da 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 dum, now we've got an E as well. Ba ba ba. And try to hear those together at the same time. And you can kind of get to a point where you could maybe hear 4 different tenor pitches, an A, a C, and an E, and maybe we throw in a high A on top of that in this tune, or an F maybe, and hear that array of pitches. Then the next thing I would suggest is to take the side drum score, which is very, very basic and not of very good musical quality because it just copies the pipe tune exactly. But da 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 dum da 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 jut jut. So that's quite simple, the beginning there. And see if you can hear in your mind's ear the first 2 bars of the pipe tune with the first 2 bars of the side drum at the same time. Looking ahead to the 3rd bar, now we have a slightly different rhythm in the drum score than in the pipe score. And so if you can hear the separate moving notes and hear the 2 against 3 triplet at the end of the 3rd bar with the pipe tune, And then if you feel like, oh, this is really easy, I can hear all these lines, no problem, then you try to imagine the sound of the full band. So you've got chanters, drones, snare drums, tenor drum, bass drum. And you can look at these scores and try to hear that sound and hear all those independent rhythmic lines happening at the same time. And you just try that with the first few bars. It's quite difficult to hold all that information in the head at the same time. But for me, that is the skill that improved my conducting the most and improved my ears the most. When you stand in front of an orchestra, you've got 60 people or 80 people that all have their own idea of how the piece is supposed to go. And not even that they're willfully trying to not go with you. They just have this, feeling and this musical intuition. And so if your own musical intuition and your own musical imagination is not strong enough that you can hear that in your head against all the actual physical sound that you're hearing, you're unable to kind of make changes, and you're unable to kind of keep the thing together. So I think the same applies for judging. I mean, if we all come in with the ability to easily hear 4 or 5 parts at the same time, and to easily pivot our attention between the different sections, and to be able to hold the ideal snare drum sound, the ideal tenor drum sound, the ideal bass drum sound, and the ideal, pipe band sound in our ears, it makes us much more effective as judges, because we're sort of listening to what the band is playing and constantly comparing it against what we hear in our minds. And so that can really, really be helpful as you're trying to listen to bands. And I think then we start thinking about the pipe band as a full ensemble, not, what does the, pipe section sounds like this, drum section sounds like this. But, the really, really great bands, the snare drum sound is integrated into the chanter sound. And the drone sound, cradles the entire band. And I think, the more that we can think about the pipe band as a musical unit rather than 3 sections, the more effective we will be at evaluating ensemble. And the last little thing I would add about this, about listening, is that you sort of have to be in multiple places at the same time. And certainly that's the way it is when you're conducting. You're in the moment listening to what's actually happened, but you're also thinking about what just happened, because you've got to evaluate it. And you're also thinking about what's about to happen. And it's the same when we're judging. We're listening. We've got to keep one ear kind of pinned on what's happening right now. We've got another ear, or part of our brain at least, that's thinking about, okay, they did this, that, and that, and I've got to write it down. And then we've got another part of our mind that's thinking about, okay, this is the 6th bar of this stress bass, so there's probably going to be a break coming up here, or something's going to happen going into the next part. So we're keeping this awareness of multiple times is also difficult and exhausting. And that's part of why judging is such a challenging job. So those are the approaches that I take to improving my listening. That's what I work on with my conducting students as well. And I think it can really help to kind of stretch the ears and stretch the musical imagination and what we hold in our heads. So any questions or comments at this point, and then we'll carry on into language. All right. So, the first thing I would say about language when working with bands or orchestras is to try to keep it simple. And there's a great joke, and now Glenn and Ken have heard it a couple times, but that's all right. That there in the Brahms Second Symphony, there's this beautiful trombone entrance, this trombone chorale, and the conductor says something like, trombones, it should sound like it's been nothing but a gray and rainy week, and all of a sudden there's a ray of sunshine that's piercing the clouds, and we're gonna have this beautiful weather ahead, and that's what the trombone entrance should sound like. And so the principal trombone raises their hand and says, Maestro, so did you want that louder or softer? And I think that's really a great example of how, as musicians, we want clear, concise, and quick information. And I was really lucky to spend 2 summers studying with the Vienna Philharmonic and sitting in rehearsal after rehearsal with all of these great conductors. And I was really shocked that the type of language that they use in rehearsal is exactly the same as I would use working with a youth orchestra, or I would use working with a pipe band. Like, it's simple and precise language that makes sense to the orchestra. And so that's important. There's also the joke about the orchestra only needs a handful of words from any conductor, and it's louder, softer, higher, lower, shorter, longer, or faster, slower. And that's all they need. And that's obviously oversimplified, but it does kind of point to the importance of a simple language and an active language, i.e. play this louder, play this softer, not this is too loud or this is too fast. We talked a bit about that on Thursday, and Jan brought up a great point about teaching and fundamentals of education, that it's better to tell someone what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do, because they're only going to think about the thing you don't want them to do. And she used a great example, which I think is fabulous, of if you tell kids don't run in the hallway, all they can think about is run. But if you say remember to walk, they'll stop running. And I think, it's the same kind of language as we're coaching and working. So positive frame comments tend to get better results for me. I try to avoid generic terms like okay or fine, because it just doesn't really give much information. I've also found that the more you can phrase comments from a musical perspective, you tend to get better results. So for example, in an orchestra, if someone's playing too loud, rather than me telling them they're too loud, I ask them if they could shape the phrase a bit more, or I ask them if they could, make this a little more expressive. And all of a sudden they play softer and they play more inside the sound of the ensemble. If someone's behind, I try to talk about melodic flow or phrasing or where the music is leading rather than just saying they're behind. The other reason I try to avoid things like that is, as a judge, it's kind of okay because we rewrite the sheets and then they read them later. But as a conductor, you're giving feedback in real time. So, too many times of saying, the horns are behind, they get frustrated, but then they say, well, we're just following you, so I don't know what you want us to do. You open yourself up for that kind of thing. So it's better to come up with other solutions there. And we'll talk about that more specifically as we get into the categories. But I think that the greatest thing about judging ensemble and about conducting, is that we're working on the music side of things. We get to comment on the music as a complete package. We get to comment on the performance. We can leave it to the piping or drumming judge to get into the weeds about the blowing on Ds and, all these other problems. So that's, I think bands would like to see that. They'd like to see ensemble sheets that really, really comment on the ensemble rather than the qualities of the three individual sections. And, we've all had different experiences with that, and it's difficult to do, but I think that really helps. I also try to avoid saying things like out of tune or not together, but rather specific things about what's going on there. And then the last little comment about language is I think it can be really effective to use emotional words from time to time. And I always think Bob Worrell is kind of the master of this, of, saying that the finale needs more drama, or that opening tune was really exciting. It's fine to use terms like that. I like, as an example, the word majestic. So say a band is coming in with a 9/8 march, and they're just kind of rushing, and it's a little bit too fast. And we could say it's slow and rushing, but we could also say, try to make this opening tune more majestic. Try to find more stature in this tune. Look for more poise. Things that maybe might make an emotional connection with the musician. They've probably already been told that they're rushing all season anyway. So if we go ahead into our 4 eyes of ensemble, or eyes of judging, and also I've got in parentheses the terminology that they use on the WUSPBA test as well. If we talk first about intonation, or what we might call tonal integration, this is a big one, because I think also what's involved here is the overall tonal impact of the band as well. So first, I think it's worth discussing the differences between words that we use all the time, sometimes interchangeably when they shouldn't be. And that's tone versus tuning versus intonation versus pitch. So these words get used a lot, but for me anyway, pitch is more of an absolute thing, i.e. the pitch of this note is A440, or the pitch of that drum is a D. And intonation refers to our ability to maintain and sustain that pitch accurately. And tuning can be used to describe the same thing. Sometimes tuning becomes more of an action word, like I'm going to tune this band or that, and intonation is a little bit used to talk more descriptively, but they get switched around a lot, and I think that's fine. Orchestral musicians tend to use tuning more than intonation. But I find I'm using both quite a bit. But I think the most important thing is to separate those from tone, which is the quality of the sound or the timbre of the sound. I often find that there are comments sometimes about, oh, that band had a great tone. But are we really talking about the tone, or are we talking about the accuracy of the tuning? Because those are two different things. I mean, you can actually... and I've experienced this before, you can tune up a band and they all play really weak reeds, and maybe their blowing is not so great, and they're actually in tune, but the tone of the band is not good. It's because there's no crack in it, and there's no... So I think, that's really a different thing. And if we talk about them separately, tone and tuning gives us two things to talk about on the sheets, which is nice. The other thing I found over and over again in orchestras is that balance affects intonation really dramatically. And we use something in classical music called the tonal pyramid, or the sound pyramid. And basically what it means is that you need to have more lower sounds than you have higher sounds. So you need the fundamental tones to be louder than the tones that are higher up. And I've often been trying to tune a chord with an orchestra, and you say, oh, maybe that fifth needs to be up a little bit, or let's lower the third, or can we be careful about the root there? And instead, if you just make one of the voices a little bit softer, all of a sudden the chord comes into tune. And with the pipe band, we're at a disadvantage because our chanters are so loud, and they're conical bore, so they're putting out this loud, bright sound. We have to really be sure, I think, that the drone sound is robust enough to kind of richen up that chanter sound. And I've experienced this setting up bands as well, that you're going around doing the chanters, and it's like, oh, the Fs are just almost there, but they're not, it's not quite right. And then I take a breath and tune the drones again, and it's like, okay, now the Fs don't bother me anymore. And so I think, if we can write on sheets things like drone to chanter volume, and I've seen some of you in this room do that before. I think that's a really valuable comment for bands. The other thing, I think it's really important that the bass drum and the tenors are loud enough that they're kind of supporting these lower fundamentals of the band, and that the snare sound has enough richness to kind of counteract the crack off the top of the drum. So, if we're looking at this chart, I would say that the bass drum and the bass drone end up in the bottom, and the tenors and the tenor drones are in the next one. And then the low A on the chanter and the snare drums are in the next one. And then as we go up the scale of the chanter, we're starting to get into that top of the pyramid, which is why it can be kind of nice to have, have that little bit of ring on the high A can maybe soften that top of the pyramid just a little bit. But anyway, so talking about bands that way could be interesting and helpful, and talking about increasing those lower tones. Now, when we talk about sounds that we can use to describe the sound of a band, and lots of these we use a lot: full and rich, bright or thin. I like the word ring. Resonance. In the operatic world, we use the word ping for if something has enough kind of resonance to get forward. I think the snare drummers say ping sometimes too. You could say dull. You could say lacking clarity or quiet. Lacking depth or having depth. I try to avoid the terms sharp and flat, because those you can have a band that is very high pitched that doesn't sound sharp, and you can have a band that's on the lower side that doesn't sound flat. It sounds full and rich. When it comes to the snare drums, I think that we use a lot of the same words, although the word choked also can come into play there if the snare sound is not coming through strong enough. And with the pitched drums, I like words like ring and sustain. If a tenor section, if the drums don't have enough sustain, the pitch of the drum is actually not coming out, and you can't hear the pitches anyway. And I'm really interested with the midsection about the accuracy of the pitches, and this brings up this sort of functional versus coloristic tuning, or whether the drums are pitched to match specific notes on the chanter, or whether the drums are just pitched in a pleasant array of low notes to high notes. And which I think I actually personally sort of prefer, because it's rare that the accurately pitched tenors actually match the notes on the chanter. I mean, it's something that they go for. But it can be really distracting, for example, if the tenors are tuned to A, C, E, and F, and the C and the F don't match the C and the F on the scale of the chanters. I think that's something that would be really great for us to comment on as judges, because sometimes the midsection gets kind of left alone on sheets. So it might be safer for lower grade bands to just pick notes that have a nice scale to them. Any other thoughts about tone, tuning, intonation?
It's a quiet group.
Yeah.
How about any experiences that people might have had either in the band or judging ensemble, where Ryan talks about trying to be able to pick out some of these elements. I know I find it difficult to pick something up and be able to write it down. If I were to pick up that the C sharp on a tenor drum was slightly off, I mean, that probably would have taken me the entire 5 minutes of a medley to figure that out. And I suppose it's we need to practice these things, but I don't know. Has anybody had experience where you've been able to kind of zero in on something that was sort of like an aha, either as a band leader or as a player or as an adjudicator?
I'll pipe in a few minutes here. I think it's hard when you're judging bands that aren't up to the grade. There's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of hard to pick up a lot. So when you're hearing that the snare line has probably 5 drums that are 5 different, even the snare drums have different pitches or sounds. The tenors are all different. The bass is different. I mean, there's a lot going on just from a drum corps, because you're just not, skilled enough. And same with the pipe section. Drones aren't tuned, chanters aren't tuned. It's a tough thing to judge. I am personally as a piper, and I had brothers that are drummers, so I have limited drumming knowledge, but enough to be able to get through and know what a good drum section is and a poor one. But having all, I think it would be easier, and I know it's easier when their bands are a lot more accomplished, grade 2 level and higher. Is that a fair statement?
That's a great point, Scott. And in fact, as we were getting ready for this, there was a few recordings we were looking at, and the final one is of SFU, and it's crystal clear to hear the pitches of those tenor drums. Super easy, but then you're absolutely right. When everything is just sort of, some notes between A and A, it's really tough.
There's 6 different interpretations of A.
Yeah.
So I think it's really difficult. And then you kind of got to make up your mind, where do you fight the battle or judging, and where do you, I try to be as positive, glass half full 99% of the time. And but I think SFU is a perfect example. I think they are ensemble one of the consistent bands ever that I've heard. They lock it in. But then there's probably a few handfuls of bands in the world that get to that. So it's I've only judged them once in my career. so that was a Victoria a few years ago. So I think it's hard when you get down to like our area, we don't get to judge bands that are finely tuned, I guess is the best way to put it, recently. And there's a lot going on. So I think that if you were to, I'll ask you, where do you fight the battle? Where do you hone in on then, other than tune your drones better? Get your snare drums all sounding the same.
Right.
Pitch your tenors right. Your bass drum sounds like it's not been tuned, and I'm being mean here, but like you've never tuned it ever. So you just roll it out there. So where do you fight the battle?
Yeah, it's a great question and comment. And I think, but I would say too that, for some of these bands, they don't have the expertise to know that their bass drum needs to be tuned. So I think, us writing that on the sheet is actually really valuable for them. But I also think that in the lower grades, it's perhaps better to go after the tone quality side of things, to encourage, like, increase the robustness of your drone sound. Look to thicken this up, those types of things, rather than very specific, you have to tune the D's and the F's on your chanters, because they probably can't do that anyway. But if they could at least beef up their sound a little bit by bringing, a better drone sound and getting their snares at least closer together, maybe that's more helpful.
Yeah, I that's a good point. And I've written that on the sheet. Sometimes I'm wondering, well, with the technology in today's age with bagpipes, with synthetic reeds and tuners, even a grade 5 band can get pretty close. I mean, at least the A and their drones pretty close. You would think, but boy, sometimes you wonder if they even do that.
I've found so many times watching groups get ready that they spend so much time on the chanters and they don't really tune the drones.
Yeah, I think the drones can hide a lot of ill will out there. As long as their drones are in tune, at least it kind of sounds okay.
Yeah. So maybe that's a comment on a sheet too, like, focus on, priority 1, getting your drones really well set to the low A, because that will make your band sound better. Yeah.
I think also if you can identify, little positive nuggets that do come out, even when a band is not, doesn't have all of the things lined up. If there's something that's coming through, I think we want to make note of that and give them some praise for for that aspect, so that they have something that they can grab onto. It's not like they're not doing everything wrong, right? So
well, I don't think I've ever, not me, but I don't think I've ever seen a sheet from. I know it's happened in the past from judges, but I don't think I've seen anybody just say, pack your shit up and go home. Basically.
Oh, no. I don't mean that. I mean, we can make positive comments that, you could get more volume from your bass drones, etc. But if there is something that they definitely are doing well, we want to point it out, whether it's tone or any of the other aspects.
Definitely.
But I agree. I agree with Ryan. I'm a guy that's a drone guy. I think Glenn can. I'm always listening to that first in the band. If the drones aren't right, you're done. In my mind, if the drones aren't locked in and stable, and it's everything else becomes a train wreck.
And then the other sections, you try and tell them, get your bass drum sounding like your bass drone, only guess what? Your bass drone's not in tune.
I think the drones are critical in all of this, but and so I agree 100% on that.
And I think there's a psychology element here too of, I mean, it's so difficult because we're trying to write these sheets quickly as we walk around the circle and get right to the next band. There's never enough time, but at least my experience, I work with pro groups, but also college groups and youth orchestras, and they're much more receptive to a critical comment if it's preceded by a positive comment. Yeah. So, if you can structure your sheet that way and say like, wow, really great, tempo and integration getting into the circle, then I would love to hear this, or, try and work on this. So it seems like people are more willing to take advice if if there's something positive first. Gets them engaged. Cool.
Could I make a quick comment before we move on?
Sure, Mike,
about intonation?
Yeah.
I think that the pandemic that we're experiencing is going to have some big impacts to us, just because people haven't been able to be around a live pipe band. And I don't think there's any way that you can really get the feel of a well-tuned, good tone without being live. Like, I've never heard a recording of any pipe band of any quality, no matter how good my earphones are, no matter how good the sound system is. There's just no capturing the real true tone and intonation of a great pipe band. And I think that that's something that that ensemble judges absolutely need to prioritize, is getting out and hearing live bands as often as they can, so that they can make sure and keep that skill well honed. Because I think it's you can try and do it through recordings, but I think it's a very poor shadow to the reality. That's my only thought there.
It's going to be very interesting listening in a couple weeks at Pleasanton, I think, with everybody coming back to it. But yeah, it's a great point, Mike.
Ryan, sorry, I just thought of something constructive on intonation. It just occurred to me that you can have two different sides to a band. This is maybe just a reminder to ourselves, to me, that you stand on one side of the band and they've got the tone is together, but you stand on the other side, it could be a completely different band. So it's maybe worth reminding us just to make sure you do go around a pipe corps, because you can have two different sides to a band sometimes, literally.
Definitely.
Just bearing that in mind.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, that's another, the question of where to stand is always a tricky one, right? And to try to figure out. But I think, yeah, trying to capture the sound. That's the nice thing about, orchestras, is we're set up in an audience-friendly format. So if the conductor's on the podium, you're getting the best possible sound. But with a group in a circle, we've got to kind of hunt it out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if we carry on to integration or technical integration, I try and avoid ever saying to an orchestra, not together. Because again, it sets up that opportunity for them to say, well, that's your fault, not ours. And but it also doesn't really give any useful information. If you stop a group, it takes a lot of time to stop an orchestra, make a comment, and if you're just going to say not together, you may as well have just kept going. And thinking about the ways that we write as well, it takes a lot of time to write something like technical integration not strong in this tune, when instead in 4 words we could write pipers ahead of drummers. And I think that gives the bands more information, and it takes less time for us. I think it's also worth always considering whether it's a musical or a technical problem. If tempos are too slow for the drummers to execute successfully based on the score that they've got, or too fast for the pipers, if it's a pulsing or phrasing problem. I'd love to see an ensemble sheet that said, pipers and drummers' approach to pulsing differs in this tune. The pipers are much longer on beats 1 and 3, or something like that, just to give the band something really to grab onto. Or the same thing, to take the positive angle to say, wow, Straspe is really pulsed well between all chords. It's nice to see that kind of thing too. And here I think is where the bass tenor work makes a huge difference, whether the tenors kind of glue the band together or they help to pull the band apart. I like to use words like, this tune could use more flow if it's dragging, or could use more pulsing if it's rushing. We often say things like better unison needed here, or poor unison in this tune, but I think we should try to be more specific. Some specific words that I use with the orchestra for when they're rushing, which is pretty rare. Orchestras generally don't rush. They usually play behind. But if they were rushing, I might say add more weight here, or add more weight to the downbeats, or make it heavier, or could we add more stretch or more lean on these pulses? Could we anchor this note? That's a great Seamus Coyne word there, anchor. I remember hearing that quite a bit. So we put anchor this, finish the phrase before you start the next one, accent the next downbeat. you know, a lot of times in orchestras, it's not so much in piping, but we'll have rows and rows and rows of 16th notes in the violins, you know, and picking like a place maybe 6 groups in to put a little accent just keeps things from running away. So finding an arrival point that we can accent together. If an orchestra is dragging, which happens a lot, I say things like, let it roll along, let it roll, let's flow through. Can we aim for the next something, you know, aim for the next downbeat, or aim for the next phrase, or, you know, phrase towards the downbeats, or anticipate the entrance. I think that would be a valuable one on an ensemble sheet. If, for example, the midsection or the side section was out for a little while and had to come back in, you know, anticipate that next entrance. You know, make sure when you're not playing, you're still actively engaged in the rhythm that's going on around you. For generic sort of not together things, you know, I say listen to each other a lot. I would say in a band, listen to the bass drum, listen for the pickup notes, focus on the clarity of the short notes, like 16th notes, breathe together on breaks or lift together on breaks, and try to arrive at accent points together. So those are all some kind of terms that get used a lot in the orchestra. We talked on Thursday just a little bit about the importance of an ensemble breathing together. Now, it's a little bit different for us because, you know, our breathing as pipers is completely irrelevant to, you know, the tunes that we're playing. It's all about keeping the sound up. But you can still have that whole group have this feeling of, you know, coming up and coming down together. And that would really kind of help pull things together. So those are the kind of things that I think about when it comes to, you know, technical integration and the groups playing together. Anybody have any thoughts about this category?
I was just going to say,
I think breathing is a very important part. Of course, I've always been, some of you might remember, I've bought different bands that I've worked with, all t-shirts that just say blow. But one of the things that working with the band, I try and just what you're saying, breathe through the break. And I'll just tell them, on this one long note break, you all need to be blowing in your bag. Don't concentrate on this long break. You're sagging, usually not picking out people, but making a point of saying, on this long break, you got to concentrate on everybody be blowing to get that note of that long held note, or in that slow air, this little phrase of the slow air. Think about where you're blowing there, which pipers don't really ever do when they should.
It's a little bit different use of the term breathing, but I agree with that. That's more of the tonal sort of thing. I think the integration part and the phrasing part it's almost more a little bit more abstract. It's the musical breathing. It's taking a breath before you get to the next phrase, or I like to say, you know, giving a phrase some air, giving the notes some air, like so that the notes themselves just sort of spread out and fill up that space of the beat. But yeah, and so it's like, you know, these terms can be used in different ways, and it does point out that we have to be really clear in how we're using those terms.
And it's tricky because if I was working with a young orchestra and they weren't getting a transition together, I would just make them audibly breathe out loud, and then they would breathe and they would be together. But of course, if we get our band to all audibly breathe or think about breathing right at a key tonal moment, then we're going to have no sound. So it's tricky. Maybe get them thinking about dancing a little bit and the way that, you know, that bounce happens. We talked, this is one quick thing that we talked on Thursday. We got through the discussion and it reminded me that oftentimes groups think that the problem area is on the arrival point. As in, this break wasn't together because we weren't together on the new beat of the new tune. But really, in my experience, the transitions are all about the beat before. And so it's not really the first beat of the stress bay that's not together. It's the pickup into that stress bay that's not together. Or it's not the first 3 notes of the slow air. It's the way that you set it up. So, you know, keeping a close eye on the way breaks and transitions are set up can be really important. Lauren, you had something?
I was just going to say, I judged a band once, judging ensemble, and the pipe corps were pretty good, you know, probably going to be second or third in piping. The drum corps, in my limited opinion, were really good, like really tight, nice sound, really tight. But boy, they weren't together. It was like literally two different bands that they just weren't together. And I was hugely confused because the piping was really good and the drumming was really good. But this, I suppose, is the classical definition of ensemble. They weren't together. So it's like, what do you do? It's quite frustrating because that's quite an unusual phenomenon when they were both good individually, but definitely not together. It was quite interesting. So I was confused.
That's a tough situation, I think. Obviously, the lead drummer and the pipe major are not seeing eye to eye on something, huh?
Yeah, there was something. Yeah.
Don't worry, Lauren. I've had a few of those, mate. Don't worry.
Seamus.
So if we carry on into interpretation, or musical integration and arrangement, or however we want to talk about this, I'd like to just talk about briefly the language that we use as pipers when we talk about sets. And a lot of times the word orchestration gets used, but in the sort of bigger music community, orchestration is usually used to talk about the combination of instruments. As in this is really interesting orchestration here, the way that there's two clarinets plus an English horn plus the violas, like that made a really unique sound. And then when we talk about the groups of tunes or how a set is put together, we would talk about the arrangement or the composition. And I think it's useful to delineate those two things because it gives us two interesting things to talk about that sometimes get lumped together. So when it comes to, pipe band orchestration, we could be talking about the choices of when to have the midsection play or not play, or when to have the sides lay out in a slow air, for example, or perhaps talking about, the choices that the snare drum section has made as far as, where the chips are and when it's just the lead drummer and when they choose to bring in the whole section and, how they bring out accents that way. I mean, those are all sort of orchestration things to me. We could also kind of talk about the harmony in that category, although maybe in the technical definition, that wouldn't fall under orchestration because it's only one instrument. I think because we're so limited, I think it's fine to put harmony in that category as well. And you could really, write a whole sheet just about the way that the drumming complements the tunes and the choices that the drum sergeant makes about when and how those sections are playing. And that becomes really interesting. It's even more interesting if a band utilizes space and silence. There's only two ways I think you can make silence in a pipe band, and that's the long low A, at the end of a jig, the long low A before the slow air, that kind of creates a feeling of silence, and when the drummers stop playing. And those are, two incredible musical tools that we have. Now, and then we could also talk about the way that the midsection or the snare line accents the melody or the rhythmic qualities of a tune. And then separately, we could talk about the composition or the arrangement of the set. And here we could cover things like bridges, tune choices, breaks, key choices of tunes, and the progression of keys. Oftentimes the lower grade bands will play every tune in A. Or they'll do like a kind of a strange progression of like A major, A major, A major, and then end on a B minor tune with a bad cutoff on a B or a D, And so I think thinking about the choice of this tune progression, it's sort of nice if a medley or an MSR is thought of as a complete musical piece and has some musical arch to it. Like maybe you start in A and you go on a musical journey and then you end at A at the end. Or even, you can end in a D major tune as well, and that can work successfully. But, thinking about those kind of things as sets get put together. With the harmonies, we could talk about whether, harmonies are consonant or dissonant. And consonant being, A, C, E, and high A, notes that ring together. Those are consonant harmonies. A dissonant harmony would be, for example, if we played a D and a C together at the same time. We wouldn't use that in harmony unless it was a passing tone, unless it was purposefully dissonant to change to another note. And so there's some opportunities to talk about harmony in that way. I find that a lot of bands right now are playing harmonies that are based on more dissonant intervals, like A's and D's together, G's and D's, A's and E's, what I would call fourths or fifths. So if you're counting intervals, you just count the name of the first note up to the name of the last note. So A to E, A, B, C, D, E would be a fifth. Those harmonies work, but only when the band is really, really well in tune, as opposed to like the kind of traditional Scots Guards harmonies where they're tuned in, done in sixths, A to F sharp. So talking specifically about those details might be interesting and helpful to the bands. Now, when it comes to musical things, it's a lot of the same words. I would talk about 2-bar phrases a lot. In the orchestra setting, we're often dealing in 8-bar or 16-bar phrases, but it's the same sort of thing. I like Ken's comment there about making sure there's enough air in it or enough space, or letting the phrase breathe. The great pianist Leon Fleischer, and I think he was quoted in the final chapter of one of the things that I sent, but he said, like, playing in time is being as late as possible without actually being late. Being open within the beat. So if you have and this maybe applies more to the drum section than the pipe section, because they're often playing much more notes than we are. But if there are 4 16th notes, they need to be divided equally into 4 parts across that entire beat, not 4 of them crushed into the front 2/3 of the beat and then space, which then just causes us to kind of lead forward. I think it's also valuable to talk about placement of the beat, i.e. does a group play on the front of the beat or the back of the beat? You can have a pipe core that plays really on the front side of the beat, and a snare core. Well, actually, this is almost always reversed. You usually would have a pipe core that plays on the back side of the beat and a drum core that's pushing on the front side of the beat to try to keep things moving. But ideally that should be the same. Phrase direction is another thing that we could talk about. And then note grouping. There's lots of books actually written just on this topic of note grouping and whether notes lead towards a beat or away from a beat, and whether pickup notes are thought of as a pickup to the next beat or they're, an offbeat from the note before. And so as we define our offbeats, we can think about the role that they play. And then, we can talk about accents and whether musical accents are the same from both cores happening in logical places and helping to bring out the quality of the tunes. Any other thoughts on interpretation? The book Sound in Motion by David McGill, I think is quite a good book for pipers and drummers as well. It's not overly detailed on music theory as far as notes and rhythms and pitches and classical symphonies and all that thing. It's a much more practical. And there's another book, and I think the title is just called Note Grouping. But that it really talks about the way that we line up rhythms and how we think about that. So the last I in ensemble is introduction. And, Ken and I were talking about this last week, and it's maybe nice to expand that a little bit to do introduction and breaks and finish. And in that way, it becomes sort of an ensemble evaluation over time. So we've got our pillars of things that we're interested in an ensemble, and now we're talking about how the band does them in specific moments. When it comes to the attack, it's so frustrating when you've heard 10 bands in a row and it's just 10 bands of E's not together, or E's close, or it might be nice to talk about again the sort of musical component of that attack. Like, wow, this was really exciting, or that had a lot of impact, versus, weak attack. Or in the rare case of a good attack, maybe the opening bars really held my attention here. When we talk about breaks, we've kind of covered some of this already, about talking about the band sort of lifting together and arriving at those breaks together. One thing I forgot to mention in the previous section about key relationships and bridges is that Michael Gray has a fantastic term for a bridge that doesn't work that he calls a bridge to nowhere. And we can have a band that is playing a jig in A major, and then they've got a second jig also in A major, and then they've got a 6-bar bridge to get them from A major to A major in the same tempo. It just doesn't make sense, right? It's kind of an added fancy thing that doesn't add musical impact. And as we're thinking as ensemble judges about, like, wow, I just really didn't like this set, you know, I have to think, like, did I not like this set because I just don't really like those tunes? And that's not really a great comment. Did I not like this set because it was too busy? Well, what does that mean? Well, maybe I didn't like this set because the tunes didn't go together. And maybe the tunes didn't go together because the key relationships didn't make sense. And maybe that didn't make sense because there were all these bridges and extra harmonies throughout the tune that didn't do anything to push the melodic structure or the melodic drive of the set. And so as we're talking about breaks, we could also talk about bridges in those moments. Like, it's fantastic when there's an exciting bridge that goes from a slow tempo to a fast tempo and takes you from a different key to a different place. But if it's just there because, you know, a group heard a top band do a bridge and they wanted to add one in, it actually kind of, I think, takes away from the set. And then when it comes to the finish, I think it's nice to think about the whole last, 30 seconds of a set and do those last two tunes, or does that last tune really bring the musical piece to an exciting conclusion? Not just trailing drones or, early burl or chanter not cutting out, which we're going to have anyway. But, if we could encourage bands to think about their sets as a piece of music and making sure that they're keeping the listener's attention from beginning to end, I think that's kind of exciting too. Any thoughts about this category? It's kind of a big one, but.
Yeah, I have one. I don't know if it's specifically about this category, but when you were talking about, us trying to figure out why we liked or didn't like a set, it occurred to me, and we talked about this a little bit on Thursday, and that is that judges are expected to hear something once and comment on it. And I think we've all had experiences. I know we have in our band where we were trying something a little bit different, a little bit avant-garde, or just kind of a bit of a risk. And some judges who hear it once would say, I don't get it. I don't understand what you're trying to do. And others that have heard it several times, at first they said, I'm not so sure about it. But then after hearing it 2 or 3 times, it's like, yeah, no, I really dig that. That's, I see what you're doing here. I'm wondering, if we're putting this expectation on judges of hearing something once, and being able to sort of rule on it. But the thought occurred to me, at the Worlds, a lot of these judges go out to the practices of the grade 1 bands and some of the grade 2 bands and just kind of take a listen, and that always occurred, my thought about that was always like, well, okay, I guess they, have some time on their hands and they would just want to listen. But part of that is probably just kind of getting familiar with, what that band is presenting. I'm wondering if that's something that in the future we should consider, around here. It's that's all I have to say, but I'm not suggesting that we go in that direction, but it's just kind of an observation that it would probably help our understanding of what bands are trying to do.
It's interesting that we're kind of at a disadvantage because we don't have as many competitions here as they do, say, in BC or other places. But as an artistic director, the part of my job that involves picking the music that the orchestras are going to play for the season, this is a huge issue because audiences like the pieces that they know. And there's actually been books written about this exact subject. And one of the things that comes to mind is talking about popular music. So when a song first comes on the radio the first time, people go, oh, that seemed kind of okay. That might be an interesting song. And then because of the way that the producers push music, you'll have heard that song 60 times by the end of the week, you know, and by the 10th time, it's like, oh, this is a great song. By the 30th time, it's like, this is the best song I've ever heard in my life, right? And a 3-minute piece, you're able to hear that, you know, in a relatively short amount of time. You can hear it 10 or 20 or 30 times. We have the problem in the symphonic world of our pieces being, you know, an hour long. Or in the case of the opera world, our pieces being 3 hours long. So if you want to listen to a 3-hour opera 30 times, all of a sudden you've invested a huge amount of time. And there are some new music festivals where they actually play the pieces twice in the concerts. So they have like, they play 1, 2, 3, take an intermission, and then come back and play 1, 2, 3 again. Because they're so worried about this exact thing. Like the audience is not going to get it the first time around. And we want to make sure they have an opportunity to understand what they're hearing. And the problem with that from the classical music world is that it's important to play music of living composers, and it's important to kind of keep this thing going. But audiences want to hear Brahms and Beethoven and Tchaikovsky. So it's a fine line, and I think maybe judges are a little bit the same way. You know, we all like the things that we know, and we like the things that we're familiar with. So, you know, how do we bridge that gap, and how do we make it sort of acceptable for bands to go out on a limb and try something new? I don't have the answer to that, but I think, you know, two contests in one day, or a showcase and then the contest, or, you know, maybe like you say, Ken, getting around the parks to hear what the bands are doing.
Hey, Ken, when I usually see the judges around in the past watching the contest, I usually put the money on Lloyd's that they're going to win. Happened a couple of years ago.
Well, we won't go there.
Scott, this is being recorded, Scott, remember?
Recorded. That's all right. It's not something that most people didn't see, but usually when the judges are hanging out by the band, that's usually a good indication that you better put some dollars down.
So can I go back to the introduction, Ryan, real quick? I tend to treat it as not just introduction, but I break it down into attack and then introduction, because they're not the same thing. I think people confuse it with just being the attack, but I'm old enough, as some of the guys are here, to remember when you got points out of 10 for the attack, and it was a big part of the competition. No longer, obviously, but in those days it was a quarter, or it was quite a big part of the overall score. But I break it down now, and I would comment on the attack, but then introduction is how they go into the tune. You know, if it's slow, or if it builds up, or if they rush into it and charge into it. So I think that's important to point out, that there's more to do to the introduction than just the attack, or vice versa. Does that make sense?
Definitely, yeah. And oftentimes the attack will be okay, but the pickup note into the first tune is not in any kind of related tempo whatsoever, right?
Yep.
Or things slow down or speed up. We talked on Thursday about the pipe major calling off the tune in one tempo, and the rolls being in another tempo, and then the pipe corps being in a third tempo when they come in. You know, and that's all related to that for sure. And just getting into the circle without the whole thing pulling apart. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the entire first part of the set really is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yep.
To go back to Ken's comment a minute ago about trying out new things, and I think ensemble judges ought to be encouraging of having bands try something new, right? And they need to try and keep an open mind and not just cast it against the framework of what the top bands in the world are doing, but rather allow some experimentation, right? Otherwise, I think the idiom is going to get stale. But to that point, if you have a band that is just really stretching out and doing Toronto Police style, doing something like absolutely brand new that has no connection to anything previous, that doesn't strike any nostalgia nerve, right? And so it might be lacking on the emotional front. And I think that would be how a good ensemble judge would approach that, is say, I really like that you're trying something new here. You ought to consider also mixing in something old, so that it does round out the set. Like find, as you're talking about, find some positive comments about it, even if you didn't love the brand new thing. Listen to it with an open mind and be willing to accept something new, but offer a positive suggestion about thinking about how we are trying to elicit emotion in our listeners. And a big part of eliciting emotion is something familiar.
I think in a way that can be one of the hardest things to comment on, is the quality of a medley, because the pipe major and the lead drummer will have spent thousands of hours putting this together. And, when you're playing it in a band, you play it, twice a week for 8 months. And so like you become very personally attached to your musical creation, So definitely, as we make comments about, the quality of a set, I think it's important that we do point out, what was working and what was interesting, and sort of soften the blow, a bit, because it can be a really personal thing for people, the way that they put sets together. But on the on the other side of that, it can become easy to sort of, what do they say, drink the bathwater, right? You've listened to your own medley so many times that it's like, this is the greatest thing ever, and that outside feedback can be valuable. But it's not music is a tricky thing as far as, doing any kind of innovation. And it's not just in piping, it's not just in classical music. Like, innovation is hard to achieve in music, because I think you're right, Mike, the nostalgia factor is such a big thing too. So if we can make comments that are specific, like, oh, I really like that you're doing something new here, but your whole opening tune is all based around low G, and I just felt uncomfortable, because there was never a moment where tonally it felt consonant, or it felt like it relaxed, or it felt like it came to an arrival point. It just was a drifting for 2.5 minutes. That might help kind of give some direction there, versus oh, I hated this tune. I mean, we all have those sheets, right? Didn't like this tune, didn't like this tune, didn't like this. You don't see that very much anymore, or the next time leave the pipes in the case, that kind of sheet. So we've got just a few minutes left. I think just, to be open to discussion, if there's any of the topics that we covered that we want to delve into a little more, or anything we didn't cover that people want to talk about. It's been a great morning with everybody here. There's been a lot of really interesting discussion, and topics been really fun. So any other topics of conversation?
One thing that was mentioned on Thursday was to ask Ryan to put together, even though this is all recorded and we could go back and jot down all the words, all the the different terms and phrases that hopefully we'll start to use more of. But Ryan was going to just go ahead and put together kind of a list of the various terms that in the different categories of ensemble. But I would also encourage each of us, just as an exercise, go ahead and do that yourself as well. Take the tone, tuning, intonation part of it, and come up with just a list, and you just go wild. I mean, like Duncan Millar came up with the word creamy, that to describe a bass drum. I mean, just go ahead and take a shot at that, see what you come up with, and then if you want to use it in a future sheet, go ahead, and you can kind of compare it to what Ryan comes up with too, and we'll distribute that once Ryan is able to get that done. Yeah. Anything else, Lauren?
I'm just going to say, I learned a great tip from Angus J once. It's safe to say this on a recording, but I was judging with him and I said, I don't know what to write. Sometimes you don't know what to write. And he said, yes, just write drones, ? Also remember that, drones, ? So it's a top tip.
Great.
Yeah, I'll have to look for that. All right. Well,
Enjoy
Scott?
enjoy next weekend.
2 weeks.
Or the one after.
2 weeks.
Or the one after.
I guess that's the first official California games since the Queen Mary from almost 2 years ago.
Yep.
Had some games up in Utah.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. Yeah.
And we did one in Colorado, a couple in Colorado.
Oh, right. That's right.
Yeah, that's right there. Yeah.
But anyway, thanks, Ryan. I felt today's session for me was a lot more productive, even though a lot of it was repetitive over Thursday. I just felt maybe, if I can say this, I enjoyed the level of participants today. Thank all you guys, because I thought the comments were much more pointed towards what we were doing. Good job, Ryan.
Yep, thanks, Ryan. It was great.
Fun.
Good job, Ryan, as usual.
Nice to see you all.
Yep,
It's good
nice
to see you guys
all.
too.
Yeah. Well, take care, everybody. Thanks again, Ryan. Really appreciate it.
Sure.
And I think we'll be doing more of this. It would be good to, like what we were talking about before, maybe having some recordings and trying to, maybe not listen to a whole recording, but listen to a piece of it and talk about what we hear.
Definitely.
So,
yeah. Add the practical element in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Be great.
This has been really helpful.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.
Awesome job.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Good job. Take
Bye.
care, everyone. Be safe.